So now we'd like to start our first presentation, and Dr. Micha Jackson is going to join us. Micha is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Queensland, and she's working on Australia's Threatened Species Index. Micha has engaged in wildlife monitoring for over a decade and is passionate about achieving improved environmental outcomes through evidence-based research and strong collaborative partnerships. So I invite you now, Micha, to join us for your presentation.
Thanks very much, Ingrid, and big thanks to Perth NRM for inviting me to talk today, and of course to all of you for joining us for this webinar. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to show you what the Threatened Species Index is up to. So I will just start sharing my screen. Yeah, I'm very excited to show you what the Threatened Species Index team has been working on over the last 4 years. Basically, I'm going to present an overview of the index and focus on mammals as well as the particular results that we've seen so far from WA. I'm sure I don't have to impress upon you that there are lots of threatened species in Australia. In fact, there are about 1,800 species listed nationally as threatened under the EPBC Act, and you can sort of see a breakdown here. You'll notice that threatened plants take up a big chunk of that total number. So for anyone not familiar, the Threatened Species Recovery Hub is one of 6 research hubs across Australia that are financed by the Australian Government's National Environmental Science Program. This hub comprises 11 partner organisations, of which the University of Queensland, or UQ, where the project sits, is one of those. The Threatened Species Recovery Hub has an overall mission to do research, to accumulate knowledge that will help land managers as well as policymakers to recover threatened species and focus on preventing further extinctions. So there's over 120 projects in the hub, and the Threatened Species Index is just one of them. So why did we undertake this project? Well, essentially, we had a very simple question. We wanted to know, how are Australia's threatened species going? And it's actually not that straightforward to answer that question. But if you think about it, we have things like stock market indices to measure and track economic health, but we don't have easily accessible indices to report on changes in Australia's threatened species populations over time. So that's what we sort of set out to do with this project. But easier said than done, as you can imagine. In places, you know, like Europe and the UK, where there's lots of people, there are really great headline indicators on trends of species abundance. And an example of that is the Wild Bird Index. But obviously Europe has a small area which is densely populated, and you can see that there are many different people who are collecting data across the place. But as I'm sure you're also familiar with, Australia is, of course, has very low population density, but the environmental diversity is very high. So a big part of the job behind putting together a Threatened Species Index was to try and figure out where monitoring data sit and try and bring them all together in one place, and of course arrange for data sharing in order for that to happen. So the Threatened Species Index research, this project has been led at the University of Queensland, and Elisa Bayraktarov, who many of you might have met along the way, was the postdoc driving the project together with the team leaders Hugh Possingham and Aisha Tulloch. I've come on board recently to take over the postdoc position, and so I'm a little bit newer to the team, but it's great to be here talking about the project and meeting all the people involved in the various aspects of it. So the team engaged early on with BirdLife Australia, and were of course supported through the NESP as well as by the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, but also by all of the state and territory governments and over 30 other conservation and research organisations, including, for example, the AWC, who you'll hear from later today. So you can see this is a really big collaborative project. It would be impossible to do this sort of data gathering exercise without lots of help. In addition, there are more than 200 friends of the index. So these are just individuals who are supporters, potential end users, or people who just care about threatened species and want to stay in touch as the index develops. So I'll let you know at the end of the presentation how you can become a friend of the index if you would like. All right, so how is the index created? How did the team go about producing the threatened species index? Basically, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we based the approach to this on the Living Planet Index. So the Living Planet Index was designed by the World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London. The Living Planet Index tracks changes in global vertebrate biodiversity through time, and it's used to report against big international targets, things within the CBD, for example. The Living Planet Index was first released in 1998, and the results are published every 2 years. The last index was published in October 2018, and it showed that global vertebrate populations have declined by 60% on average between 1970 and 2014. So a really important sort of global metric of how biodiversity is doing. But the way that the Living Index compiles data is through published scientific literature. And that's, to track the population abundance of thousands of different species, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians all around the world. So you might think, well, why did we need to make an index? The problem was that the Living Planet Index does not contain very many Australian threatened species. So there's only 24 threatened mammals and 7 threatened birds currently included in the Living Planet Index. And this is because most of the raw monitoring data on threatened species in Australia never gets published in the scientific literature. It exists as raw data on people's computers, in reports of recovery teams, in state and territory repositories, all sorts of different places. And so this project sort of endeavored to try and bring all that together, all the monitoring data on threatened species that we could together into one place, so that we could look similar to the Living Planet Index at how our threatened species were doing overall. So a key challenge, of course, has been finding all of the available data. As I mentioned, we've had support from all state and territory governments, as well as 30 other orgs or so to do that. So identification and provision of data was sort of the first step. BirdLife Australia hosts the raw bird data and provided stewardship for the threatened bird index component of the overall index. But it sort of, the index development itself sort of sat at UQ. And the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, as well as a research computing centre, both at the University of Queensland, as well as a fantastic web app developer called Planticle, they have helped us to develop an automated scientific workflow to streamline the processing of all this data. And finally, the Zoological Society of London helped us to adapt the Living Planet Index into a method that we could use for Australian data. So obviously a key theme of this is that there are many partners and many stakeholders in this project. So in the project, each data set that we receive is reviewed against a framework of selection criteria to help us make a decision on whether this data set would represent a reasonable trend or result in a biased sort of indices. So for each incoming data set, we ask whether monitoring and unit of measurement has been provided and whether this monitoring was standardized. So it's really key that monitoring has taken place in the same place, in the same way over time, so that the values for different years are genuinely comparable. We check whether the species locations overlap with the distribution range that we know of for that species. We use only data sets that have, of course, more than 2 years of monitoring. We look at whether monitoring has been performed consistently through time. So, for example, for species with strong seasonality, were they counted in the same season, for example? And finally, we check how representative the data is for the extent of the species of interest. So that's sort of how we determine which data sets we are able to integrate into the index. And then there's a lot that happens between that point and the endpoint, which is a publicly available web visualization tool. So first, we have an automated scientific workflow that we created to process data that is actually uploaded into the database. And this has been essential because we're talking about large volumes of data. We've got probably now over 500,000 individual surveys represented across the different facets of the index. So within this process, we do those data quality checks, some of the stuff I talked about in the previous slide, and also some checks to make sure that the information's been entered accurately. Then we group data by yearly values, and we allocate it to biogeographic regions. The aggregated data is then published in an open access database. We then do the index calculation itself, which is using that living planet index methodology. And then that allows us to produce a graph, the index itself, which you'll see a lot of in a couple of minutes. And finally, we provide a web visualization tool where people can go and interrogate this data and look at the indices grouped in different ways. And I'll show you some examples of that. So that's sort of a lot of context and background to the index. So now we'll get into the real guts of it. Well, what have we actually found from doing all this so far? So birds were the first group of species for which an index was produced, and there's been a threatened bird index for Australia released in 2018 and another one in 2019. So these are the results from 2019. What you can see is that the index shows the average change in populations compared to a base year. Okay, so the base year, the index level is 1. And what you're seeing here is the relative change to that base year. So if we had, for example, a score of 1.2, that would mean there was a 20% increase on average at the end of the time series compared to the beginning. So you can see from this index that between 1985 and 2015, on average, across all of the data sets we have, there was a 59% decrease in threatened Australian bird populations. And this was based on 65 species or subspecies monitored at over 17,000 different sites with over 400,000 different surveys. And you can see, hopefully you can see that there's a bit of a cloud around the line, and that's not actually a confidence interval for the trend. What that actually is it's a metric that represents some species decrease a bit more and others a bit less. So the grey cloud actually shows the range of trends for all the individual species that make up this multi-species trends. So to go with the index, some regions of Australia, of course, have poorer data available than others. And so we've developed some diagnostic tools to help us understand the robustness and the representativeness of the data that is underpinning the index. So this slide shows, so that same, the threatened species for index for birds, so the same as the slide before on the top left, but the map on the top right shows where threatened bird data is recorded. So light blue indicates less data and pink indicates more data. And you can see from this map that the national index is representative of most of the eastern states, of course, but we have a harder time, as always, in the arid zone, in the NT and in WA. The plots on the bottom, so the dot plot on the bottom left, that shows the particular years for which monitoring data was available. So basically, if you have dots all across that x-axis, that means you've got a really consistent data set over time. And as you can see, a lot of the data sets are, of course, clustered in more recent years. So we don't have that many data sets that actually stretch all the way back to 1985. And the plot on the bottom right is kind of just another way of looking at this. It's showing the number of species, that's the black circles, and the number of time series, that's the blue diamonds used to calculate the value for each year in the index. And what's interesting is when you start subsetting the index, you can sometimes actually see funding efforts represented in this graph. So you'll see, you know, either a decrease or an increase across a certain number of years that corresponds when a particular program that did lots of threatened species monitoring was funded or defunded. So that's sort of an interesting result. So this is the WA threatened species index for birds. So basically have just subsetted that, that main index into just WA. So you can see where the data came from, and you can see that there was about a 55% decrease on average, but a bit more variability in the trend than we saw. So the overall number is quite similar to the overall index, but a bit more variability. And rather than those 65 odd species, this data came from about 22 species and subspecies and just over 1,000 different time series. So hopefully that's a good intro to the index. I'm actually going to spend most of today talking about mammals. So talking about mammals, the first crack at the Threatened Mammal Index for Australia came out earlier this year. And this just gives you an idea of all the different people that contributed mammal data. You can see there's quite a good spread across governments and different organizations. But this is the data that we received for the index. It doesn't mean that all of this data actually went into the final index, because this is before all of those sort of data cleaning and selection criteria processes that are applied. But still a pretty nice spread of data for the first crack at mammals. So this is the results for the first ever Threatened Mammal Index for all of Australia. So you can see that after an initial increase at the beginning of the time series, we ended up somewhere around, on average, a 38% decrease across all different threatened mammals. And you can see that there's a bit of a spread across the trends for different mammals. So I'll talk about that more in a second. So this represented 57 species and subspecies. You remember we started out with 80 odd, and after the data were cleaned and went through that selection criteria process, we were down to 57. But still over 9,000 surveys included. And if we look at those diagnostics, you can see obviously we have a better distribution around the coast, but reasonable coverage across Australia. And certainly a general increase in the number of species and data sets included over time, of course, not surprisingly. But what's interesting and what was really clear with the mammal data is that you know, some threatened species populations are managed more intensively than others, of course. And so based on information provided by the custodians of the data in the index, we were able to drill down more into this overall index and look at trends, composite trends for sites with no known management, sites with any type of conservation management, so safe havens, predator baiting, fire management, etc. And then sites that were without introduced predators, so basically islands and fenced enclosures. And we found that this really strongly affected the results in the case of mammals. So mammals with no known management declined on average by about 60% across 30 different taxa. So that's a bigger decrease than the overall index. Mammals with any management on average increased by 40%, but you can see that there's a huge spread across the different species. So some increased, some still decreased, but on average, that's a much different trend than the overall one. Even more striking is mammals without introduced predators, so those on islands or in exclosures, on average increased by 500% across 15 different taxa. So a very strong signal from the mammal data that, you know, management efforts do make a big difference to the trends. So I'll just have a look at the WA data now. So for the 2019 WA index, we found an overall average decrease of about 61%. So quite a bit higher than the average decrease for the whole country. Mammals with any management decreased by 75%. So that's quite a surprise. That's a very different story than we saw from the national data. But mammals without introduced predators sort of similarly also showed an increase, although it wasn't as large as the national average, so about 116%, but that's based only on about 8 taxa. Mammals with no known management declined only by 9%, so that's interesting. That was sort of a surprising result. But that's based only on 5 taxa, so it could be coming more from sort of data paucity than anything else. So just to sort of summarize the comparison between the overall Australian index and the results from WA for 2019, for birds, total time series for Australia, about 17,000, for WA, about 1,100, taxa 65 versus 22, time series for mammals, 1,100 versus 152, so about a tenth of the total data was from WA, the number of taxa, 57 versus 19. The average change in birds, very similar between the two, between the Australian index and the WA index. The average change in mammals, quite a lot steeper decline in WA than nationally. And the average change in predator-free zones was positive for both national and WA, but not as positive on average in WA as nationally. So I would encourage you, if you've never been to the website, if you go to tsx.org.au, you can see all of these types of graphs that I've shown you. You can subset the data in different ways. You can download a subset of the data that is identified only to IBRA subregion, but you can download the data that's in the index. And yeah, so I really encourage you to interact with it if this is of interest to you. If you see here, the third tab over is called Visualize, and then you can go to a drop down that's called Visualization Tool. So what's next? So we are planning to produce a new threatened bird and a new threatened mammal index this year. In particular, the mammal index should have quite a lot more data in it than it did last year. So it'll be really interesting to see how those updated results change the overall figures. And we are having a first crack at the inaugural threatened plant index. So stay tuned for that. So finally, yep.
Oh, you're finishing up, are you? Cool.
Yep, that's the very last slide. If you want to receive updates on the index, please be in touch. You can email us and request to become a friend. And we're, of course, always on the lookout for additional data. So if you have data spanning multiple years on threatened or near threatened species, we would love to hear from you. All right, thanks to all of our partners and many, many collaborators. Hopefully most of those are listed here.
Thank you so much, Micha. That was a really interesting presentation, and I think that it's certainly I was aware of it, but didn't really have a sense of how the index worked. And it was really interesting to see the comparisons between Australia and Western Australia. So thank you very much. And we're going to go on to our next presenter now, Dr. Rochelle Stevens. So we'll talk to you later, Micha. Thanks.
Thanks.